All right. Well, I want to mix it a little bit, and instead of just going on with the Serling Post-Twilight Zone, want to just backtrack or sidestep a little bit, and want to talk a little bit first about Anne Serling's book about her father. Give her a while to just talk about some of the anecdotes behind the book, the making of the book, and her life with her father, and then also talk about Rod Serling books. So, Anne, uh, you wrote the book, or it was published in 2013. How long had you been writing the book about your father?
It took about 6 or 7 years to write that book. And there were really three reasons that I wrote it. One was to navigate that whole minefield of grief and to find a way to manage it. I wanted to know more about my dad's professional life. And there had been some things written about, some fallacious things written about my father that described a man that was not remotely familiar to me or any of his friends. And so I thought it was an opportunity to set the record straight.
Do you want, I mean, without getting into libel, what, can you give like at least just one example of something that was out there in the media that was distorted?
Well, one of my dad's, his novella, Season to Be Wary, was out with Random House, and there was one of the writers said that my father was furious. Actually, it was with Little Brown, and my father, is this correct, Mark?
Yes.
And my father, it was said that my father.
He said that the writer said that your father was furious at Random House for not publicizing it, and to which I said, why should Random House publicize a Little Brown book?
Exactly. And that was just one example, and they also described him as this tortured, dark soul, and that was not anyone that my father was. Any description that would have been accurate.
That's true.
So does the book start from your early childhood and then trace through your father's death, and does it go past, post your father's death into his legacy as well?
Well, in the beginning, I talk a lot about my dad's childhood and when he was going off to war, in a box of letters that I found that he had written before he was sent to training camp. Letters to his parents, letters from his parents, letters to friends. And this was actually a pretty poignant, powerful time of writing the book, to read these letters. My dad was only 19 when he went off to war, and that's the age that my son was when I was writing it. So it had an impact on me to see how young my dad was, and any person that goes off to war. And then I talk about growing up with my dad, essentially.
I know what you're talking about. I remember years ago, my mom and I opened up my dad's old locker or trunk when he was in the CC camps during the Great Depression, and we found a lot of old letters from girls in Idaho calling him killer and sweetie, and my mom was like, I don't know who these girls were. But it was pre-marriage, of course. But so how long is the book, and do we get mostly personal anecdotes as well? I mean, can you give, like, say, an anecdote from the book, whether from your childhood, between your mother and father, if you guys took a trip someplace? What's one of the more standout, more memorable incidents from the book that you describe?
Oh, boy. Well, I talk about how my dad was a practical joker, and I think Mark Olshaker, you commented on, or Mark DeWitziak, I can't remember which one of you commented about my dad would appear in lampshades and things like that. Again, this speaks to who he was as a person, not this professional side. My dad also did a hell of an imitation of a gorilla, and would frequently do this monkey act, and it was really quite hilarious. My father was funny, brilliantly funny, and my friends, who might be wary about meeting him for the first time, thinking this is the Twilight Zone guy, would instantly feel comfortable when they met him. He just had the capacity to sort of make people feel comfortable and important. And
Dan, I can tell you this book is the best book that's ever been written about Rod. It's deeply personal and very meaningful. And I'll tell you something that Anne probably won't tell you, which is that a number of readers, more than a few, have come to her, written to her, and said that this book helped them deal with their own grief and their own sense of family. So I can't think of a better tribute.
Yeah, actually, Mark, thank you for saying that, because I did a reading before the book was done at the Paley Center, and a woman came up to me afterwards and said that her father had a terminal illness, and that after hearing me read, she knew she'd be okay. And this was overwhelming to me, and what a gift this was, to know that in some way my words had meant something to her and had helped in some way. And I've heard that from a lot of people that dealing with grief, that it has helped them. And this has just, been so gratifying and so humbling to know that it's helped people in some way.
Let's talk about a little bit about your relationship with your father through the years, because your father would have died when you were around in your early 20s or so. It's probably been, it's been 40 years since. Were you and your father? Did he spend more time at home after the Twilight Zone and between Night Gallery? Were those few years the most memorable for you? Did you I know I read that he had gone on the lecture circuit for a while. Did you ever travel with him when you were younger?
I was, well, to your first question, I had just turned 20 3 weeks before my dad died. I do remember traveling with him once when he went to see his agent. I can't remember, in Chicago, I think that was. I know in the Mike Wallace interview, he talks about how his workday was 12 hours a day or something. But I never felt that my dad wasn't accessible or available, despite, long work days. He had an office in the backyard. And so although we weren't supposed to bother him when he was working, we always knew that, in an emergency, we could go knock on the door. And
in the intervening years between your father's death and you're writing this book, and also I assume you're involved in the Rod Serling books, which we'll talk about in a moment. Were you involved in any of your father's other projects where you like the executive of his estate? Because I know in the 1970s that the Twilight Zone magazine was big. In fact, I remember reading a Stephen King story, and I'm not a big Stephen King fan, but a friend told me that it was a Stephen King story in like 77 or 78 in the Twilight Zone magazine about a guy who would fall asleep and then he would live, it was maybe transporting to another planet, and they would put you in a deep sleep, and if you woke up during the sleep, you would experience all of time then, and you'd come out on the other side a wizened old man. And that was one of the stories that always stuck with me. So did you have any hand through the years in any of the projects, like the later Twilight Zone series, as his daughter or executor?
No, my mother was involved with the magazine, and in terms of the two Twilight Zone shows that had a pretty short-lived, I think, existence, I had no say in that.
Okay.
But and let's add that some of your earliest professional writing were adaptations of some of your dad's stories.
Right, I actually novelized One for the Angels and The Changing of the Guard. Of course, my dad did the hard work. All I had to do was flesh it out. But that was a very rewarding experience and fun to do.
Let me contradict her. There was a lot that went into it, and it showed how beautiful Anne's writing is. Adaptation is not easy.
Well, if I could say something that Anne will not say about her own book, let me brag a little bit about the book, because it is on two levels. It is about her dad, but it is about her own journey dealing with grief, and it's a profound experience. And but there's something else about the book on a personal level. I'm the one person on your panel, Dan, who did not meet Rod Serling. I'm the one person here who did not have that privilege. And I've read throughout my life everything that's ever been written about Rod, every interview he ever gave. I've seen practically every scrap of footage of him on anything from, commercials and quiz shows to the Twilight Zone Night Gallery. And reading Anne's book was the very first I was meeting the real Rod Serling. this is the only way you're going to meet him. This is the only way you're going to have that honor and that privilege is to read, and it's a fully developed, real human being who comes across in this book, and I couldn't find him anywhere else.
And
As much as the Twilight Zone, I couldn't find him in the Twilight Zone. I couldn't find him in all of these other things, but I did find him in Anne's book, and it's
I certainly recognized the man I certainly recognized the man I knew in Anne's book.
And I would assume that, Anne, when you were saying that you had nothing to do with the 2 TV revivals, you also had nothing to do with the film that was made?
No.
No. Okay. So let's move on and talk about SerlingBooks.com. How did that come about? And let's talk about its provenance and what you're hoping to do, and what have been any books released so far. How did that come about, and was that you who initiated it?
Well, it's something my husband and I had talked about, and we, with the publishing world collapsing as we know it, we wanted to provide a platform for established writers and new writers, and we thought this would certainly be something that my dad would champion. So we've now published 8 books that were out of print, Patterns, Requiem, a couple of Twilight Zone books. My dad novelized 19 of the Twilight Zones. Night Gallery stories that he novelized, we've also put those out. And Season to Be Wary, which was a novella that my dad did, where actually 2 of those episodes became Night Galleries.
And they all have introductions by some very distinguished and insightful writers.
Like Mark Olshaker and Mark Dwitziak.
And Anne Serling.
And yeah.
I'm looking, it says on the website, the Serling genre, and it's very Twilight Zone-ish, and then I also see content guidelines like against pornography, offensive content, cursing, etc. I'm just wondering, do you think that might be limiting? Because I had mentioned like a film like Goodfellas, and that's a film that has a lot of cursing and whatnot, but you can't really deny it's a work of art. Do you think that you might have too strict the guidelines?
Well, we're certainly open to cursing. And I also wanted to add that we also just printed an anthology with 11 writers, and that's just come out. I don't think the restrictions that you've mentioned have, I don't think it's been problematic in any way.
No. How about, because it seemed that, there's the term I would use is probably, there's didactic, it looks like it's a didactic, and that's not, I don't mean that in a pernicious sense, but are you looking for all the same? I mean, ideally, let's say if a young writer comes along, what are you actually like looking for? Are you looking for something that's definitely Serling-esque, or if it's something that just approaches the same topics, even though it might be in 180 degrees?
Well, Mark Dwitziak, you can speak to this too, that initially we wanted something very Serling-esque, and one of our writers had submitted something that really wasn't, but it was so damn good that we decided, is this something my dad would have liked? And then that became the new criteria for what we would publish.
So WWRD, what would Rod do?
Yeah, right.
I think this goes back to something we talked about before. What is Serling-esque? Well, it's a very wide thing, isn't it? If you limit it and say this is Serling-esque, and you think, well, this is the Twilight Zone. Well, what was the Twilight Zone? It's not quite fantasy, but it is. It's not quite science fiction, but it embraces it. It's not horror, but it touches on it. And that's just within genre. But then you look at all of the live TV dramas they did, the post work, all the themes we've touched on, the boxing, his incredible interest in writing and writers. When you come right down to it, what is Serling-esque is a very wide interpretation, and should be. So
the only thing that connects it all is a moral sensibility.
That's right. That's right. So are we going to pursue projects with Rod Serling books which are distinctly reminiscent of the Twilight Zone? Yeah, we probably will. But will we exclude something which might be Patterns-like or Requiem-like? No, we're not. If it's a good piece of writing and it's and it fits the moral sense of what, and also the sense of social responsibility that, Rod had. So we see this as a very, not restrictive, but a very open interpretation of what would Rod do. Well, look at the amount of things that Rod did do, as Mark was saying, in those 20 years. Look at the sheer volume of work and variety of work. All of it is Serling-esque in one way or another. So
what we're looking for is imagination and a sense of the world.
I just want to add that both Marks are on our board of directors, as are Scott Skelton and Jim Benson, who did the Night Gallery book.
Well, let me take the idea of Serling-esque and let's talk about some of the post-Twilight Zone work. But let me just detour for a second. I've had an argument. We talk about artists and what defines them and whatnot. And over the years, when I was a kid growing up, I used to watch a lot of the talk shows. I mentioned in the break some of the. I want to do a show on classic talk show hosts, and one of the frequent guests was Orson Welles, and Orson Welles about in 1949 had starred in a film called The Third Man, directed by Carol Reed, and it's considered one of the great film noirs and one of the great films of all time. And there's always been a controversy because Welles had claimed throughout the 60s and 70s on these shows that he had a greater hand directing-wise than was credited for. And if you look at Carol Reed's work, Third Man is very much out of his general line of work, and and that's the famous one with them on the Ferris wheel and looking down at the people like they're ants. And I've always argued that a great artist has such a distinct stamp on things that there's no way that I can believe that this is all Carol Reed. Wells, I mean, I could get into many of the things, but they're so Wellesian. And in a similar way, if we're talking Serling-esque, I want to talk about the Planet of the Apes, because I've always read that, Rod Serling wrote the first draft and that was it, and they threw out 99% of it, and they only kept basically the famous ending with the Statue of Liberty. However, I've always thought, when I go through that film, and just going through chronologically, just off the top of my head, there are so many images that are so Serling-esque or Serlingian, however you want to say it, that I have to feel, and let me just finish my little preamble here. In the opening of that film, they find out that the woman that they've been traveling with when they crashed, the three men, died centuries ago because a pebble hit her container tube or whatnot. So right away we have this is a testosteronic movie. There's no women that are, even though the one woman, Nova, is mute. Then you have the X's that mark the forbidden zone, that are very reminiscent of what you saw in World War II around Nazi death camps. You have the first image of the general ape coming through the cornstalks, and it's like a giant phallic symbol rising up out of Mother Earth. You have the famous, monkey see, monkey do, don't hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, human see, human do. And to me, these are all, and then there's the get your filthy paws off me, you damn dirty ape. To me, these seem so Rod Serling-esque that I have to believe, just as a fan and someone who watched it, that he had more input than he's credited for. Am I crazy or right, Anne?
Dan, I think you just said it.
Yeah.
I want to say, from what I understand, my dad, he was the initial writer brought on board, but his script turned out to be too expensive to make, and that's when they brought in Michael Wilson, I think, the second writer was. Mark Olshaker, you were so helpful to me when I was writing my book and learning more about the professional side of my dad, and I think I may have learned that from you, actually.
Yeah, no, that's true. So, yeah, a lot of it was toned down, if you will, and changed. But you're absolutely right, Dan. I mean, the essential Rod is there in the script, and it wouldn't have been had he not been involved with the project.
And I
agree. I absolutely agree. There are lines throughout, because I not only visual, Dan, you're talking about visual, but the ear picks up things that are so Serling-esque, if you will. And sometimes they're even throwaway lines. There's a point where Charlton Heston is trying to escape, and somebody's giving a speech in the background, and he says, and he never met an ape he didn't like. And I thought, that's Rod. That is, I mean, there's no way that's not Rod. You know, so yeah, you're right. You watch that movie, and there are elements all the way through.
The museum with stuffed humans. I mean, that goes back to running a numerous Twilight Zone episodes where you'll see humans as playthings for other creatures. I mean, whether it's apes or aliens, you know. And the thing is, for even putting aside being a large studio, it's hard to imagine. I mean, that's one of the most blistering political films of all time. I mean, it really is. It touches on race. As I said, there's no women. It touches on religion, the fundamentalism of Dr. Zaius and denying the truth of the rise of the Planet of the Apes. I mean, that film to me is alongside with The Third Man. I mean, as Wellesian as The Third Man is, Planet of the Apes is Serlingian, and you know, I've argued this with people, and they say, "Oh, well, no, it says so here or there." I say, I don't give a damn. I mean, I'm an artist. I write. I know what I'm seeing, and I know that you don't get the same cadences. You don't get the same observations. I mean, like you mentioned, you could take an Oscar Wilde or a Mark Twain script, and you can have 10 film doctors, script doctors come in. It's the essential. The baseline there, the bottom, the undergirding is Serling.
This also goes back. This also goes back to Eye of the Beholder, where what's beautiful and what's ugly.
Yeah,
yeah, and there's also certain scenes, as you're saying, Dan, as a writer, you can analyze Planet of the Apes, and there are certain dialogue exchanges which are 100% Rod's cadences in writing. The point where, you know, Heston looks at Dr. Zaius and says, "I scare you. I've scared you right from the beginning," and it's right. I'm thinking, you know, and I think that's a Rod piece of dialogue.
The little doll that squeals and it falls to the floor. I mean, that's right out of the Burgess Meredith kind of episode. You know, the dropping of something. I mean, it's So
when he says to him afterwards, you know, we were here first. Yeah. We were here, and you know, Zaius says, "So why aren't you still here?" You know, it's a moment that's very much right out of the Twilight Zone, if you will. So I agree. I think that film has Rod's fingerprints all over it.
And if you look at the other Planet of the Apes films, the subsequent ones in the initial series, you look at the 98 or 01 one and the current one. I've only seen clips of the current one, but I've seen enough big scenes in the 01 one. That first film is just so good, you know.
But the intellectual subtext is gone from those other films.
Right.
You know, what's the missing ingredient?
Right. And so before we hit Night Gallery, let's talk, were there any other film scripts or screenplays that Rod had been working on at that time that got produced, well, didn't get produced, and why not? Anyone?
7 Days in May is certainly an important film.
Oh, yeah, right, yeah. That Cuban Missile Crisis? No.
It was a plot to overthrow, a military plot to overthrow the United States. And
Frederick March plays the president, and Burt Lancaster plays a general who is planning a coup d'etat, and Kirk Douglas plays his aide who realizes it's his role to try to, again, a man caught in the middle of a moral dilemma, a classic Rod Serling story, if you will, although it's based on a novel. But here is Kirk Douglas in the middle of all this, trying to stay true to the man who was his mentor and his hero in many ways, and his country. It's a very powerful piece, and I think 7 Days in May comes closest to blowing up the canard that Rod couldn't write a screenplay.
And also pick up on what Mark just said. It's also in a military setting, and to go back to his experience in World War II, it's also about when do you not follow orders.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. So it's a very tightly written piece.
Before we get to Night Gallery, let me just ask one final thing. I know Anne had mentioned novelizing some of her father's stuff, and I guess maybe some other people have. I remember reading somewhere, and I don't know if it was in Mark Zickery's book or something years ago, that one of the sort of things that haunted Rod Serling was that because he felt that he had been birthed in the medium of television, he felt a fear of failure to try to write a great American novel along the lines of Mailer. Is there any truth to that?
No, there's no truth to that. This would have been a natural evolution for him. He had begun in 1967 with The Season to Be Wary to try longer form fiction, and he was quite good at it. I went to visit him. It was my senior year in college, so this would have been probably December of 1971, 70, or January 1971, and he showed me a manuscript he had already written and was polishing based on his teleplay A Storm in Summer. Now, I don't know whatever happened to that, but I distinctly remember seeing it, and he told me he was working on another novel. Now, interestingly enough, Anne was away at school at that point, and let me turn off the phone here. Anne was away at school at that point, and he had written her a letter about 3 weeks after my visit and talked about a novel he was working on that he thought she would like, and neither Anne nor I really know what that novel was or what became of it. But if he had lived, there's no question in my mind he would have become a novelist and a good one.
I agree with that.
So let's talk a bit about Night Gallery. When did that come out? And I know that's sort of been, I vaguely remember that as a child, and I probably saw some, I think in the late 70s, they ran it late night with like Barnaby Jones and Mannix repeats as a kid. I remember seeing some of them. How did Night Gallery come about, and what was the overall fate critically of it?
The pilot of Night Gallery was actually based on some of the short stories, the novellas from The Season to Be Wary. One of which was Eyes, which was directed by a young guy who just come on the Universal lot named Steven Spielberg. And Mark, I think you know what happened to him. What was it?
Yeah, he did something or other. We lost track of it. But yes, and it was done as a TV movie by NBC and aired under the title Night Gallery. Rod wrote a third story. There was a third story in the Season to Be Wary that they decided not to use. So he wrote one more story.
And it was racially oriented, which was very interesting. They even in 1971 or whatever it was, they were still afraid of this concept on television.
Right. So this got NBC interested in perhaps doing a horror anthology, and it started out at that point NBC had these wheels. The most famous was their mystery wheel that would alternate Columbo with McCloud, with Macmillan and White, and there was always a fourth element that they couldn't fill. So they decided they had a concept they called 3-in-1. And Night Gallery rotated with a couple other elements for its first year, and then was a weekly series for a second season, and then limped into a third season, and it was canceled. Night Gallery I love Night Gallery. Let me first get this out there. I'm a huge Night Gallery fan. Night Gallery came along at a time when there was not. We take horror for granted today because horror is everywhere. You turn around, there's The Walking Dead, and then you turn around and there's, Twilight, and there's, it's everywhere you turn. Back then, there was very little that was done in the horror field. There was Hammer horror films would come along every once in a while. There was Dark Shadows on daytime television. But, if you were a horror fan, when anything came along, you jumped on it. And all of a sudden, there was this thing called Night Gallery, and Rod Serling was fronting it. And I was in junior high school when it started. And I was, I'm like, this is for me. They made a series for me. Now it is not the iconic series that The Twilight Zone is, largely because Rod had worked so hard on The Twilight Zone. That was such an incredibly intense experience to be the producer, the lead writer, be on camera, that he said, I'm not going to do that again. So, I'll be your on-camera host and I'll be a contributor, I'll write, but I won't produce it. I don't know whether he'd go back and he would take that one back or not because
Yes,
what
he
a
would.
guy.
He told me so. He became
Jack Laird.
very frustrated that when he did want to step in and exert some editorial control, he was totally rejected from it. And in fact,
Patronized,
when he was doing Twilight Zone, he used to hang around the MGM studios all the time. I remember by the time he was doing Night Gallery, he would drive over to Universal, do his bits, and leave immediately and go back home.
So
well, I remember Jack Laird's name spoken throughout the house because my father would say his name through gritted teeth. He was so
Jack Laird's the producer.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because he had no creative control, and it became a show that made comment, my dad said, on nothing. It became sort of a cheap horror vignettes. But my dad, there were also some excellent shows on Night Gallery. One being they're tearing down Tim Riley's bar, which is very much like the Twilight Zone episode Walking Distance, which either was nominated for an Emmy or it won an Emmy, Tim Riley's bar. But it's a lovely, lovely script.
Yeah, and there was another, what's the other one that's really important?
The Messiah's Due on Mott Street is probably the up one.
The Messiah of Mott Street, again, a beautiful, beautiful piece.
But, and that's it. Night Gallery, it would be terrible not to be. Jack Laird and Rod's instincts were diametrically opposed. Right. Jack Laird loved these stupid little vignettes, these blackout sketches, these comedic things which cheapen the show. But at the same time, some excellent writers worked on Night Gallery. Richard Matheson contributed a couple of stories to Night Gallery.
It's interesting that Mark mentions these blackouts because one of the creative concepts that kind of went awry with Night Gallery was, unlike the Twilight Zone, unlike anything else that had been done on television, each story was supposed to have its own natural length. If it was a 5-minute story, fine. If it was a half-hour story, fine. So what Jack Laird ended up doing was essentially filler, wouldn't you say, Mark? Where
yes.
He would have these blackout sketches with people like Victor Buono,
right,
or totally comic things that were just silly and stupid.
Yeah, like a stupid joke on Phantom of the Opera or Dracula or something like that. And in the middle of this, you had some really first-rate storytelling that was done. So Night Gallery it's a failed series by any counts, but I would hate for not to have it.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that I think Rod's introduction work on Night Gallery is wonderful. He has, if anything, he's loosened up a little bit. He's smiling a little bit more. He almost, maybe because he wasn't so deeply involved, and I realized it wasn't a good experience, but he's masking it. This shows you how good an actor Rod was. He's masking it awfully well in those introductions. And there are several episodes of Night Gallery that linger with me, and several of them are Rod's script. He wrote one called Soul Survivor.
Yes.
And Soul Survivor is a wonderful. I often joke that Rod wrote the metaphor for my life, and it is Soul Survivor because I keep going from one doomed newspaper to another. I am that guy in that episode who gets set adrift in the Titanic and gets picked up by the Lusitania. I said, "Not me, it's right there." But I can remember that episode, watching it the moment it aired the first time. So there are some wonderful episodes. And several of them Rod wrote. And he had to compromise an awful lot. It was very frustrating for him to compromise. It was very frustrating for him to know that this series could have been so much more and so much better. But I would hate not to have Night Gallery. It's still a series which, it's a series of moments. Let's put it that way. It's a series of wonderful moments.
I was just looking online, like, the Tim Riley episode you mentioned had the old game show host Bert Convey. Another one had Ron Howard's younger brother Clint Howard in it.
The boy who could predict earthquakes is a wonderful episode.
I see Sue Lyon from Lolita. I told you last week I was doing a Kubrick show, so she was in that. And the thing I remember about the show is at the time, I think there were all three networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. There was a fad for about 2 or 3 years. I think it was after Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In became big of this blackout sketch thing. There was an ABC show called Love American Style, and I always thought Night Owl is sort of a cross between Twilight Zone and Love American Style, because you mentioned.
Not bad description.
Well, yeah, I think because I remember there were a lot of silly things. The problem was the little funny things. They didn't have an Artie Johnson or a Ruth Buzzy who that they could just say, okay, we need 3 minutes, improvise something. You mentioned Victor Buono kind of thing. They always seem kind of stiff and awkward, those little filler inserts.
And became a show that was not what my dad's intention was. For the most part.
Well, let's talk then about the last few years of your father's life. But between his death and I believe he died. I rewatched I think it's American Masters or American Experience, 90-minute show from I guess it's the late '90s or so, or early O's, on your father. And did he die on the operating table or did he die of a heart attack or?
Well, the show that you're talking about is called Submitted for Your Approval,
Yeah.
and it does begin with the surgery, which always bothered me. But my dad had 3 heart attacks, and the decision was then to have open heart surgery, which of course in 1975 was a brand new surgery.
Yeah.
Today it would have been a very, very different outcome. My understanding is they finished the surgery, and when they closed him up, my dad had another heart attack and died 3 days later.
Oh, okay. Was there anything in the works at his death? Was he planning any other series? You mentioned Mark Olszak. You mentioned a novel that never came to fruition. Do any of you know, did he have any deals going on for movies or screenplays or anything?
He was working constantly.
Rod was what there are certain writers who love the canard about, well, I hate writing, but I love having written. Well, the heck with you. It's about hard work. That's what it is. And I think Rod understood that. And Rod was one of those writers. Tennessee Williams was a compulsive writer. He was constantly writing. Mark Twain was a compulsive writer. Rod was a compulsive writer. He was somebody who was, if he wasn't writing, he was thinking about the writing process. He was thinking about the next story. He was thinking about the next, I picture Rod's brain as just constantly firing, and Ann can speak to this better than anybody, but you can sense this when you study the man's work. This is a guy who probably would have never, ever, ever stopped. He had a boxer's mentality. Requiem for a Heavyweight. I know I've used this phrase before, but Rod understood that you were on this planet for only a certain amount of time. And no matter how many years you get, it's a short amount of time. And you do not stop swinging until the man counts 10.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And he understood that, and I think that was how he went through his entire life.
I once asked him, I said, does the writing ever get easier? And he said, no, but you become less afraid of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
lovely way to put it.
Well, let's end this segment before we do a final closing segment. Let me just ask about Rod Serling in the 21st century. Obviously, with the Rod Serling books, you guys are looking to propagate his name and legacy. In the 40 years since his death, let's talk about the last 40 years critically. The way books that have been read. You mentioned Mark Zickery had written a book, I believe, was Mark Scott Zickery, I'm not sure. And what do you think going forward in this century? Let's talk a little bit about legacy. Anyone want to, either the Marks, do you want to talk about where we are now?
Well, I'll just say that Rod was probably the worst evaluator of his own legacy. He would be shocked to, in the last interview he did, and he also said this to me personally, he said 100 years from now, if his name is just remembered and the term writer is put next to it, that would be enough for him. I think he would be absolutely shocked to know how tremendous his impact has been, how many books, how many articles, how many shows have been done based on that, and Ann has participated in this every year in his hometown of Binghamton, New York. The fifth graders every spring do an entire unit on morality and society based on Twilight Zone episodes. I've been privileged to speak before them. Anne does it every year. I think he would be absolutely shocked. And the proof of that is, it's often been said in the Rod Serling community that I was the only one who he ever authorized to write his biography. That's a little bit of a strain. What happened was I was, as a young man, already a professional writer, I asked him if he would cooperate with me on writing a book about him. And he said he would absolutely cooperate and do whatever I wanted, but he had to warn me that he thought there'd be no interest from publishers. Unfortunately, that was the case, and we couldn't sell the book idea. But that turned around very, very soon after that, and whether Anne likes the books or not, the important thing is the attention has never ceased. In fact, it's continued to grow. And the fact that some of our most distinguished commentators, like Mark Davidziak, know so much about him, can speak so articulately, I think that's one of the greatest testimonials we have.
I'll go ahead, Anne.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to piggyback on what Mark just said. The program that Mark is talking about in Binghamton, New York, it's called The Fifth Dimension, and the entire fifth grade, all of the fifth grade classes watch the Twilight Zones and study them and learn about scapegoating and prejudice and mob mentality. And although these kids are only fifth graders, they really get this. And I said this in the book, I believe this would have been my dad's greatest accolade, to know that these kids are watching these shows and getting it.
The idea that they are talking, that these kids who were born, whenever they were born in the 21st century, are learning about hate, mob mentality, things like that from watching The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, I think would absolutely stun and delight him.
Right, and also the book that Mark Dawidziak, you're about to launch, Lessons from the Twilight Zone.
Well, and I'll add one other thing to that, because I sort of get to test this every semester, because I teach 2 courses a semester at Kent State University. And let me back up just for a second to make a point. The pop culture does not leave a lot on the shore. Every wave of the pop culture that comes in, it recedes, and it takes most of what was the pop culture at the time back out with it.
Very, very true.
Very, very little on the shore. So generation to generation, there are not touchstones for people that they identify. From the Beatles, my daughter knows the Beatles as well as the Elvis. Whether you like Elvis or not, Elvis, you're going to get Elvis at some point. You're going to get Star Wars at some point. People understand, may the force be with you. But when you really look at the things that were big in each era, in each generation, there's very, very little that people understand. I say the name Columbo, which I wrote an entire book about to my students. Not one of them recognizes the name.
Yeah.
Now, that was as big a show as there was, and Peter won 5 Emmys for playing that part. It's gone, folks. Yeah. The Aunt Griffith Show is gone. This is a generation, one of the first generation that has not lived in Mayberry, that does not know what Mayberry is. Yeah. The Honeymooners was gone years before that. You could say Bang Zoom to the Moon, Alice, to somebody today, and they won't know you. You could be quoting an ancient Greek play as far as they're concerned. So the pop culture moves faster and faster, and it leaves little. There are 2 black and white television shows that my students still know and recognize. Only 2 is I Love Lucy, iconically, and the other is The Twilight Zone. Yeah. They're the only 2. My students have lived and visited The Twilight Zone at one time or another. And we're talking about a black and white television show from now, we're getting close to 60 years.
With minimal production values, it just wasn't important. None of that.
And it's the storytelling that endures. It is the storytelling that continues to endure and continues to work generation to generation. So it's one of the reasons we're still talking about Rod Serling, because the Twilight Zone continues to be one of the very few things that jump generation to generation. There's no mistake that there is a thrill ride at a major amusement park named for the Twilight Zone, named for this television series from antiquity.
And
So
there are a lot of songs called there are at least 3 or 4 songs called the Twilight Zone that have charted in the last 40 years.
That's right, and so that is one level of, the relevance of those stories continue to speak to us. They continue, and the other thing that I have noticed is that in my job as a TV critic, I have interviewed practically every major showrunner of every acclaimed show of the last 38 years. Because when I started as a TV critic, Dallas was the #1 show in America, and there were 3 networks. The name that keeps coming up over and over again, who influenced all of these writers who are writing these great cable dramas today, is Rod Serling. There is no close second. There is no close second in this field.
A while ago, Anne and Mark and I set out just to notice in a very informal way how often the phrase Twilight Zone appeared in the media, in newspapers, television, magazines, whatever. And we gave up very quickly because we were just overwhelmed by it. It has become a standard concept, a meme, to use the current terminology in American society.
Yeah. And you can use the iconic image of Rod Serling. You can use him in The Simpsons, you can animate him, and you can use him anywhere, and people will know who that is supposed to be. You can use him in a Saturday Night Live sketch, and people will know who it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's why the Twilight Zone is still relevant. It's why it's still alive. It's why it's going to continue to be alive. And as I have said before, I'll quote myself, it'll be relevant when we are staging plays in Alpha Centauri 200 years from now. The Twilight Zone will still matter at that point.
Yeah, just to echo your earlier point, I know I had mentioned Project Gutenberg, which the books that are all online now for kids to get free. I had to go to a library and wait 2 or 3 weeks for something to become available when I was a child. And I tell my wife and I both write, and we're both very good writers, and I say, you want to know what's going to be the fate of the bad postmodern writers like a David Foster Wallace, or people like a Jonathan Franzen who write glorified soap operas, or you want to know about the people who write the crap vampire books, just go to Project Gutenberg, because alongside of Mark Twain, alongside of Ambrose Bierce, alongside of Miguel Cervantes, you will find 10,000 times many more books and names of people who wrote the bestseller in 1898, who wrote the bestseller in 1912. I remember just about a year ago reading something called like Betty Goes to College, and it's one of these really twee novels about, oh, a woman's going to college. Isn't that interesting? And this was a bestseller in 1908 or whenever it came out, and yet you look at it, I mean, it couldn't have been by the 1920s. The jazz age, it must have been dated, and yet this woman was well known. She probably sold the equivalent of a blockbuster book back then. The second thing I wanted to talk about, I just mentioned just to end this, is I've always lamented the loss of live television. I think that I had mentioned earlier, either in the interview or off camera, how the Newt Minow quote about the vast wasteland of television in the early 60s, which I think was a load of crap then. But I think that the internet is right about at that same point. 1960 and TV time is right about now, internet time. And I think there needs to be a Rod Serling person who, not necessarily as a writer, but as a writer combined visual medium, could come along and do, because we got web series that are these soap operas, we got web series that are sometimes educational and whatnot. But I don't know if you, Anne, or the people involved in Rod Serling books might want to look to people who submit 20 or 30-minute screenplays in a Serling-esque vein and have them produced on a YouTube, because that's the medium that you're going to reach young people. And if you have a junior high schooler or a high schooler, that they're going to be watching YouTube. They're not going to be watching the cable stuff.
Dan, we've already talked about this, and anybody watching who would like to give us a grant to produce these, we would happily accept it.
Yeah. So I just wanted to put that out
Stay
there.
tuned.
Yeah. So let's just end this segment, and then when we get back, we'll just wrap up, and I'll give each of you a final say so, and we'll do that in just a moment. All right, let's wrap up this interview. It's been a long, but I think very enjoyable and very informative discussion on Rod Serling, and I know one of the reasons I do this is to get to these things because there's more to life than just celebrity nipple slips and dancing squirrels online, or at least there should be. So let me go around the horn. Start with Mark Dawidziak. Let me just take a couple of minutes and say whatever you want to say about Rod Serling or future projects related to Rod or anything else you've got going on. Mark?
Well, I'll go back to where I started. I think that anybody who wants to pursue writing and storytelling would benefit from pursuing the path that leads through the Twilight Zone, leads through Rod Serling's career. And what you're going to discover is not just great storytelling and not just relevant storytelling, but you may just discover a hero in there as well. I did. And I know that many other writers who write television, from David Chase to Vince Gilligan, have said the exact same thing. So one of the reasons Rod Serling matters and will continue to matter. So I don't think anybody will be anything but rewarded for encountering the name Rod Serling.
Okay. Mark Olshaker, just so people know, I will have links to all relevant websites, to Ann's website, to the Rod Serling books and whatnot below this video. But if you want to give, Mark Olshaker, maybe if you want to give out the Rod Serling address and then your closing thoughts.
I believe it's rodserlingbooks.com, isn't it, Ann?
Yes.
Yes, and we commend these books to all of you. You will not be disappointed to see how relevant these books written more than 40 years ago, some of them more than 50 years ago, how they absolutely still resonate with what's going on today. I would only end by saying that a week from tomorrow will be 40 years since Rod died, and there has not been any time during that time that I've not thought about him, not felt he was with me professionally and spiritually. I remember, I didn't have the kind of relationship with him that Ann did, clearly, but I remember my grief, and I'll go further than that and say despair, when he died. And the three of us are now significantly older than he was when he died, and yet we still look up to him as the primary figure, and I think he'll always be with us, and I think that's one of the things that a legacy that Ann and I share.
All right. Well, thanks, Mark. Ann, if you want to take us out, your final thoughts on your father, either personal and also if you want to plug your website as well.
Well, there isn't a day that goes by that my father doesn't float across my mind. And I just also want to say that it's an honor to be with both Marks who helped fill in the missing pieces and who know so much about my dad's professional life, and Mark Olshaker, you know more about my dad's personal life too. This has been fun. And my dad would have been so surprised that here we are, all these decades later, talking about him. And I'm sure he would have had something self-deprecating, I'm sure, to say about that, right?
Well, I'll add one more thing if I can,
okay, go ahead.
Which is that I was first able to meet Rod because when he was president of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, he came to my town to give a speech to the local chapter. And my mother was a producer my mother, who was a teacher by trade, had become a producer in one of the early educational radio stations here in Washington. So she was invited, and she took me. I was absolutely thrilled. So it was because of my mother that I was able to meet and become a close friend of Rod's. When my mother passed away, the first public outing I had was to drive up to Ithaca with my wife and go to this conference and meet Anne, and who I think we'd actually met once before, but we weren't sure. And so I met Rod through my mother, and right after my mother died, I met Anne, and I wonder if my mother got together with Rod and said, "Okay, we got to bring these two together now."
Well, I want to thank you all for your commentary on the life and career of Rod Serling, American television producer and television writer. I talked earlier about existentialism, and for those who enjoyed this conversation, my next interview will be the second of a three-part series I'm doing on the nature of existence. About a month ago, I interviewed an Episcopal bishop named John Spong. This coming Wednesday night, I'll be interviewing a philosopher named Tyron Goldschmidt, and we'll be talking about existence and everything. So I think Rod Serling would probably want to watch that one if he could. So again, thank you all three.
Thank you.